the screen as well. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of the first and the last, who was dead and came to life. I know your affliction and your poverty, even though you are rich. I know the slander on the part of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Beware. The devil is about to throw some of you into prison so that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have affliction. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Whoever conquers will not be harmed by the second death. This is the word of the Lord. We're going through and looking at these love letters, these love messages that Jesus has for the churches, 7 early churches, and every single church has a unique situation that they're going through, and every single church, we ought to, as a community of God, be able to look at that church and associate with it. Maybe say, yeah, I can relate to that a little bit, or I can learn a lesson from that a little bit. And in all these letters, Jesus is showing each church that one unique fact. He's saying, if you are fueled or powered or motivated or moved by anything other than my grace, my love for you, you will fail as a community. You will not succeed. Though you may look on the outside, like we saw at the church of Ephesus last week, he'll say you may look like you're doing well, but inside you'll be dying unless you're renewed by the gospel, by the truth of my grace and love for you. Every day, every week, and that's what has to lead you as a community. And the same way we look at the churches, we can look at our own hearts, and Jesus is saying, take stock, evaluate where you are in your place as a Christian. Are you being led by my gospel, or are you being led by something else? And today we look at the church of Smyrna, and this is a unique letter because it's one of only 2 of the 7 letters in which Jesus has no problem with this church. This is one of only 2 of the 7 letters where Jesus doesn't condemn them, doesn't say you're doing something wrong. It doesn't say to them, fix this thing. We saw last week the church of Ephesus, though it looked great on the outside and it was doing great things, their first love had gone. But for Smyrna, we don't see that. Jesus doesn't give them anything that they're doing wrong. They're doing everything right, and because they're doing everything right, you and I would probably expect Jesus to say something like this. You guys are doing well. You're not like Ephesus. You have your love, you have your heart, you're passionate, you're faithful. Good job. We expect Jesus to say something like, congratulations. Jesus to say something like, here's your reward. But he doesn't. He does something that is actually very counterintuitive. He looks at the church in Smyrna and he says, because you are faithful, you are going to undergo deep and painful persecution. Deep and painful suffering. Now, if you're anything like me, you probably would say that doesn't sound fair. And it doesn't look fair to us. But Jesus reminds this church in Smyrna, and he reminds us that in the life of a Christian, you will undergo suffering. When we looked at the book of James a couple months ago, James was very adamant about this point, saying, in your life as a Christian, you need to expect suffering. But when suffering comes, as a Christian, you have a unique ability, you have a unique tool set to fix it, to deal with suffering and pain and hardship and loss. And Jesus there in verse 10, he predicts their suffering. He says you're going to be suffering for 10 days. And commentators argue, a lot of commentators will say that 10 days means that there will be an end to it, that it will be very short. Actually, the book of Revelation is heavily symbolic when it comes to numbers. And the number 10, much like the number 7, represented completion. Remember, you have 10 fingers, you have 10 toes, hopefully that's complete. And so what he's saying here is you are going to undergo such a complete amount of suffering that it will take you to the point of death. Remember we talked about how each of these cities was an emperor-worshiping city. And of course, Christians did not worship the emperor. And if you didn't worship the emperor, you were subject to boycotts, losing your job, losing your family, even death. And he uses this word for affliction. You may have in your translation, he says, I know your affliction. Some say, I know your suffering. This word, this Greek word, is a very heavy word, and it's used only a few times in the Bible that I can find in the New Testament. And it means excruciating pressure. Like, imagine a boulder, a huge, huge rock, coming down on your shoulders and grinding you, and grinding you. And this is what Jesus says the church in Smyrna should expect, because we've been faithful. Now, that doesn't sound fair, like I said. So let's look at what he says about suffering. What does Jesus tell us about suffering and pain and fear? And what can we learn from this? There's three things. One, and you can follow in your outline. One, first we have to look at the fact that suffering tests our faith. Suffering tests our faith. But two, suffering also tests our fears. And lastly, and ultimately, suffering tests our crowns. It tests our faith, it tests our fears, and it tests our crowns. Let's look at this first. Verse 10, he says, you will be tested. He tells the church in Smyrna, you're going to be tested. Your faith will be tested by suffering. And we know this to be true, that we can believe, we can have faith, but when we go through suffering and when we go through pain, that's when our faith is most revealed. C.S. Lewis, one of my favorite writers, wrote a book about his wife who died of cancer. Actually, he lost his mother and his father to cancer. Then his wife, who was his best friend, his lover, his confidant, his partner, he loses to cancer. He writes a beautiful book called The Grief Observed. And in that book, I'll quote it a couple times during this message, but he gives a great illustration of faith. And he says his faith is like a rope. Now, it's all well and good to say that a rope is strong if all you're going to do with it is wrap a present or wrap a gift to give someone. You have a piece of string, you wrap your present, and you say, well, this rope is pretty strong, isn't it? He says, well, one thing to say that it's strong when you're wrapping a gift. It's another thing to say that that rope is strong when you're hanging by it off a cliff. See, he says losing his wife was a test to his faith because it made him see that his faith, he had to hold on to it for dear life. There's parts in the book where he writes beautifully but tragically about how he feels like he's dying inside because of the loss of his wife. And he says, when suffering comes, it tests your faith. But, and here's what's interesting about the church of Smyrna. Suffering doesn't just test that we have faith. It tests why we have faith. It tests why we have faith in God. Do we only believe in God when it's convenient? Or do we believe in God even when it's inconvenient? Let me give you an example of this. Look back in the letter to the church in Smyrna, and you see this very, very famous verse, verse 9. And he says that these supposed Jews are actually a synagogue of Satan. Now, this is a very troublesome verse. Throughout history, many, many people have looked at this verse and said, this is anti-Semitic, meaning it's anti-Jew. It's saying the Jews are evil and the Christians are good. And that's not what he's saying. He's saying something much more subtle here, but you have to dig a little deeper. Now, historically, let me give you the picture. Let me paint the picture. At this time in Smyrna, remember we said that this was an emperor-worshipping city. You had to worship the emperor. You could worship your God, but you had to worship the emperor. But what was unique to the Jewish community was that they were exempt from worshiping the emperor. The emperor said, you can have your own religion, you can worship in your own temples. Actually, many times in many of these cities, the Jewish population was exempt from military service, meaning they didn't have to serve in the Roman army. They were exempt from some of their taxes. They were a special sort of religion that the Roman government had given special privileges and special rights. Now, all of a sudden, this small Christian minority starts growing within the Jewish religion. Remember, first century, people looked at the Jewish religion and they saw Christianity as part of the larger Jewish religion. So this small group of Christians starts to grow and grow and grow. And what happened was, as the Christians grew, they threatened these rights that the Jewish population was so comfortable with. The right to worship, the right to avoid military service, the right to not pay some taxes. So let's put this in context. This is your family. You have a nice Jewish family, you have all these privileges, and all of a sudden, maybe your son, or maybe your daughter, or maybe your brother, maybe your wife, maybe your husband decides to convert to Christianity. If they find out that you're living with a Christian, you can lose everything. All those comfortable rights that you've grown accustomed to can be taken away from you by the government at this time. So naturally, what we have here in historical records is large amounts of Jews who were turning on their own friends and family and outing them and saying, they're Christian, I'm not. And therefore, their friends and their families were being cut off, excommunicated, driven out, oftentimes put in jail. See, what Jesus knows here, he's looking at this Christian church in Smyrna and he's saying, will you follow me? Will you have faith in me? Even when the ones you love the most turn against you? Your friends, your family. What if they were all to leave you? Would you still have faith in me? The Christians in Smyrna would have to ask why they believe what they believe. Not just question the object of their faith, but the reason for their faith. Was it convenient, Jesus says, for you to follow me? Will you be faithful even when your brothers and sisters turn from me and you lose money, you lose your job, you lose your wife, your husband, your kids, you could lose everything. Will you still believe in me? So suffering, first we know that when suffering comes on to us, as it was in the church of Smyrna, it questions our faith, but it questions why we believe. Do we believe only in the good times? Or can we believe even in the darkest of times? C.S. Lewis talks about his faith in the book of Grief Observed, and there's a quote I put in your bulletin where he sums up exactly what losing his wife did to his faith. It shook him. It made him know that his faith was real, but he had to ask tough questions and go through the suffering. And he says, nothing less will shake a man, or at any rate a man like me, out of his merely verbal thinking and his merely notional beliefs. He has to be knocked silly before he comes to his senses. Only torture will bring out the truth. Only under torture does he discover himself. What he's saying there is he would never know how much he believes in God. He would never know why he believes in God if it hadn't been for that suffering, testing his very faith. But we also know from the letter of Smyrna here that suffering doesn't just test our faith, but it tests our fears. Suffering doesn't just ask the question, why do you believe? But it also questions, what do you fear? And why do you fear it? In verse 10, you notice this, look back at verse 10. He says, don't be afraid of the suffering. Now, if God is talking to you, this would be very odd for him to say. Imagine if I'm your friend and I come up to you and I say, you're going to go through a lot of pain and a lot of toil and a lot of suffering, but don't be afraid. No, that's not good advice. If I was a real friend to you, I would say something like this. You're going to go through suffering and I'll be there for you. Or I'll say something like, you're going to go through pain and loss, but I'll still be your friend. I'll be here for you. Jesus doesn't say that to them. He tells them, do not be afraid. Because he knows that Smyrna, the church in Smyrna, will be tested, not just in their faith, but in their fears. Let me give you a picture of what the church of Smyrna was like to help understand this point. The city of Smyrna was wealthy, very, very wealthy, as we know, and it actually still exists today, but under a different name. And the city called itself, it gave itself its own nickname. And if you ever know anybody who gives themselves their own nickname, you know that that is an extremely arrogant thing to do. They gave themselves the nickname the first city of Asia. They put it on their coins, they put it on products that went out of the city. They called themselves the first city of Asia. They were wealthy, and also they were unique because 2 times in their history, they were destroyed by earthquakes. And yet they built themselves back up from the ground up. They resurrected themselves. This was one of their mottos, that we have resurrected our city. And they did this twice after natural disasters. This was unheard of at this time. They were self-sufficient, stable, secure, wealthy. And Jesus looks at them and says, don't fear when suffering comes, because he knows that when suffering comes, we begin to fear losing the things that we have put our value in the most. Smyrna as a city put its value, put its identity, its worth. It was called the first city of Asia. That was its nickname. And Jesus says, hold on. When suffering comes, you're going to be afraid. And you're going to be afraid why? Because in suffering, we learn that we can lose it all. Everything that we built up, our bank accounts, our jobs, our prestige, our comfort, our security. Jesus knows this when he looks at Smyrna and he says, Something's going to come along and it's going to destroy all that. Your wealth won't matter. Being the first city of Asia won't matter at all. And when you go through this type of suffering, because you're going to die, some of you, from it. I was listening to U.S. radio, American radio, and there's a journalist who was giving an interview. His name's Martin Main. I don't even know if he's a popular journalist, but he's well known now because at about the age of about 45, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And if you know Parkinson's disease, it's horrible nervous system disease that eats away at you, and it takes away every skill that you have, motor skills, nerves, thinking, cognitive skills, everything gets wiped away over time. Slowly it erodes. It's debilitating. It's destroying. And this man was unique because at the age of 50, he was in such a condition that he had to obviously quit being a journalist and move into assisted living. He couldn't even take a shower on his own. He was so physically unstable. And he was giving this interview, and the reporter asked him, she says, "Are you afraid? Are you afraid of dying?" And he said something very interesting that I thought, which sheds light on this idea that suffering can test our fears as much as our faith. He says, "I'm not really afraid of dying. Dying is part of life." She says, "Well, what are you afraid of?" He says, "I fear losing it all." Let's think about that. He says, "I don't fear dying, I fear losing it all." And of course the reporter asked him, "What do you mean by losing it all? Death is losing it all." And he says, No. He says, "See, journalism for me," he was a journalist for his entire life, entire career, a reporter, and he said, "Journalism for me is not just a job, it's my life." See, at the minute that he said that, it shed a light on what he really values. Because he wasn't afraid of dying so much, he was afraid of quote-unquote losing it all, and losing it all for him meant the skill to be a journalist, because that's all he felt valued. That's all he ever knew, that's all he could do. He says, if I can't type, I can't live. See, giving up his journalism was his ultimate fear. Giving up his career, what he had made a name for himself, was his ultimate fear. Not even dying, but losing everything that he built his reputation and his life on. Jesus looks at the church in Smyrna and he knows the very same thing. When suffering comes, you're going to be afraid. Why? Because you fear losing the things that you've held so valuable. But it's not just that. Suffering doesn't just test our faith, it doesn't just test what we fear. The suffering tests our crowns. See, if you look here, Jesus is basically saying, if you rest your value, if you put your worth, if you put your success in anything other than me, it will ultimately leave you, it will abandon you, it will fail you in the end. We see this in that story of the journalist. In the end, his body, his mind was failing him. But Jesus tells us something in verse 10 here. He mentions the victor's crown. He says, if you get through this, if you prevail, if you look to me, I will give you a crown that will never be taken away, that can't be touched, that's more beautiful and radiant than you ever thought possible. And to understand what he's really saying here, again, we have to look at we have to learn a little bit about Smyrna. There's 2 points he's making about the crown. The crown of our life. See, Smyrna was known for 2 things in relation to a crown. One, they held an Olympic-like sporting event every few years. Very, very big, not as big as the Olympics, but still very big. And if you won an event, you were given a crown of laurel. You were given this beautiful crown and paraded through the streets as a national hero. Sports to them meant way more than it probably even does to this day. They were given this crown and you were called a hero because of what you had accomplished. We also know that the city of Smyrna was a city located next to a cliff, a bit large hill, and on the hill was a crown. And then the other nickname for the city of Smyrna was the Crown of Asia. There were a crown of buildings, and these buildings were the temples. They were the temples to the gods. These were the things in the high place that Smyrna was most proud of. This was their crown. When Jesus, he knows this about the city. He's looking at the city. He sees this crown of buildings that they put so much pride in. They put so much value and worth in. And he says, that's not your crown. I have a different crown for you. Jesus knows that in suffering, if we have formed and made our crowns, what we put on our heads, out of what we value, what we take pride in, if it's anything less than his crown, the crown he gives us, it will fail. We know it now because those crown buildings in Smyrna are now destroyed. They no longer exist. The very thing that this city put its pride and joy in does not exist anymore. And God and Jesus looks at the church and says, if you do that, it will leave you. But my crown will never leave you. I give you the victory crown, not based on what you accomplished, not based on what you did, but based upon what I did. He knows deep down in our hearts that if we form a crown, if we crown ourselves with anything other than the crown He gives us, that crown will fade and wither and leave us in times of suffering and pain and loss in our life. How do we know that we get this crown? How do we know? How do you and I know that this crown that Jesus talks about, the victor's crown, how do we know that we have it? In verse 9, Jesus says, I know. If you look back, He says, I know your afflictions. Now this word know doesn't just mean that He knows it in His head. It's deeper. It means that He's experienced it Himself. Jesus knows our afflictions because it was He who was first afflicted. In Matthew 27, we see Him beaten. We see Him bloody. He was afflicted for us. He says, I know your poverty. In 2 Corinthians, Paul writes that Jesus gave up His kingly riches to become poor for you and for me. I know your afflictions because I was afflicted, Jesus says. I know your poverty because I became poor for you. And He says, here's the victor's crown, because I gave up my heavenly crown for you, so that you can have this crown. The crown tells us, the heavenly crown tells us, that we're infinitely more broken than we could ever imagine. That we're infinitely more loved than we could ever dream. And we know that when we go through our suffering, it's a shadow of the ultimate suffering that Jesus went through on the cross. Remember what crown He wore on the cross? He wore the crown of thorns. And there's a poem that I didn't put it in your outline, but it's in your bulletin. On the back of your bulletin, you can look. And it's by a famous Christian poet, Martha Snell Nicholson, who we know went through, for 30 plus years, she was bedridden. She went through 4 incurable diseases. She went through suffering like nobody else can imagine. Most people can never imagine. She went through this horrible suffering, and she wrote so much beautiful poetry about Christian suffering and the thorns. And this is one of her famous poems. And it reads, I stood a mendicant, which means beggar. I stood a mendicant of God before His royal throne, and begged Him for a priceless gift which I could call my own. I took the gift from out His hand, but as I would depart, I cried, but Lord, this is a thorn that has pierced my heart. This is a strange, a hurtful gift which Thou hast given me. And He said, my child, I give good gifts, and gave my best to Thee. I took it home, and though at first the cruel thorn hurt sore, as long years passed, I learned at last to love Him more and more. I learned He never gives a thorn without this added grace. He takes the thorn to pin aside the veil which hides His face. It's a very beautiful poem that the thorn that God gives us in our life is actually filled with grace to pin the veil so we can see His face. But I think Jesus on the cross would say much more. He would say, the thorns didn't peel back any veil. The thorns pierced my head. The nails pierced my hands for you. So that you know on the cross that Jesus gave up His crown and took this thorn deep into His body and His spirit. So that you and I have crowns in heaven. When suffering comes, and it will, it's inevitable. When suffering or pain or hardship comes in our life, we can either be fearful, we can either be paralyzed by it, or we can look to the one who took the thorns for us. And we can know that whatever thorns we have are nothing compared to the crown that we have through Jesus Christ and His grace alone. Please pray with me. Lord, we construct our crowns out of everything other than your grace and mercy. We make our crowns out of our achievements. We make our crowns out of our intellect, our abilities. We make our crowns out of every bit of pride that we have and vanity in our lives. Remind us, Lord, that it's your crown that you have given to us that really matters. Let us rely on the simple fact that you and you alone We'll be there in our suffering. You love us. You're going to test our faith. You'll test what we're afraid of. Yes, but you'll also show us there's a crown for us that will never fade. Your suffering was so much greater than our suffering. We can get through our suffering. We can get through our pain only when we see the pain you experienced on the cross, Lord. We crown you with many crowns. Take away our crowns of pride and glory, and let us look to you, Lord. Once again,